Africa has created the largest free trade zone and the largest customs union in the world through the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, with many more African products and services becoming widely available starting next year amongst African member states. But will this change the price of milk, as it were? Dianna Games, Chief Executive of Africa at Works and also Executive Director of South Africa-Nigeria Business Chamber, joins us on Skype from Rosebank. And in Abuja, we are joined by Taiwo Oyedele, who is a partner and West African tax leader at PwC Nigeria. To both of you, I thank you for your time. So, Dianna, let's start with you. At the beginning of the year, RMB came up with something called the Milk Index. It's how they value whether African currencies are overvalued or undervalued. In the same vein of that index, Dianna, I ask you, will the African Continental Free Trade Agreement change the price of milk for us Africans, and when?
Well, that's a really big question. I think the thing to remember with this is it's a very long-term program. If you look at other free trade areas that have preceded it, for example, the tripartite FTA between COMESA, EAC, and SADC, there's a lot of unfinished business there quite a few years after it was first launched in 2011. So, and we're not really seeing many results out of that as yet. And to be fair, there has not been the same kind of political will behind that as there has been behind this Pan-African initiative. But it is a long-term process, and there are many, many issues that need ironing out. Issues of tariff phase down, of competition law, of infrastructure, of customs regulations, and so on. So there's a very long way to go, I think, before we can see any radical changes in prices and even availability of goods, because it is a long process.
Taiwo, let me jump on to you. Your country, well, at least the country that you're in, was the noticeable absence from the original wave of those countries that became signatories. Have Nigeria's problems in this regard really been answered, considering the lobbying that President Buhari had to go on before ultimately putting pen to paper?
Yeah, indeed. Clearly, Nigeria had concerns about the free trade area, which was the reason why we did not sign initially, and now we have signed. And I think ultimately the concerns that Nigeria has are not very different from the other countries. Maybe, the other 53 countries that signed before Nigeria just got to a point where they felt comfortable before Nigeria did. I think ultimately, if you look at it, maybe we are not seeing the big picture enough, generally across Africa. There seems to be an extraordinary focus on trading goods, whereas the treaty itself covers trading services, it covers investment policies, it covers issues to do with intellectual property rights. And I think these areas are just as important as trade in goods, because if you look at a country like Nigeria, services constitute over 50% of our GDP, which means that is very significant. If you look at our entertainment sector, we call Nollywood. This is very popular across Africa, but I'm not sure that the entertainers are making money from it because of issues to do with property rights. So ultimately, to your question also that you asked first to Dianna, the price of goods and services should go down in the medium to long term, because when countries try to protect their borders using tariff, what they do essentially is to levy taxes on their citizens for local inefficiency. If you can get every country in Africa to focus on their area of competitive advantages, it means that they do something better than the rest of Africa. They can produce for Africa, so everybody then focuses on their area of competitive advantages, and people of Africa would benefit from, affordability and good quality, ultimately.
Then let me move on to you now. Dianna, you touched on this a bit earlier about the tripartite alliance, but there are more groupings than this. I mean, one thinks about all the regional groupings, ECOWAS, the East African Community, SADC. what becomes of now the second tier of agreements, essentially, and what's their purpose now?
Well, I think they are the building blocks to this Pan-African initiative. And I don't think they will go away. There's a lot of work that's been done. There's a lot of stuff already. You know, quite a few countries actually overlap different free trade areas as well. So I think at some point, a lot of if the Pan-African initiative really moves forward, these regional trade groupings would have to have another look at what they're offering, and is it still relevant and useful. So I think that the point is that at some point this big initiative should overtake the others. But as I said, this is a long-term process, and in the meantime, people still have to trade in goods and services, and they need sort of protocols under which they need to do this, and so therefore those agreements will still be holding for some time to come now.
Taiwo, we've all read George Orwell's Animal Farm. You are familiar with the phrase, some will be more equal than others. Largely, trading blocs have always been dominated by some member countries. I mean, clearly you see that when you look at the European Union and just how much muscle Germany has in this regard. And most people said that this particular agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, meant nothing until Nigeria came to the party. Do you believe that we'll just end up with countries who have more muscle than others, and effectively end up with claims that some are at a disadvantage of this trade benefit?
Yeah, you're right. To a very large extent, I think the concern also is because you find some of the countries in Africa, apart from the largest ones, Nigeria and South Africa, you also find countries that they're worried about that dominance. But I do not see that happening because of Nigeria. I say that because Nigeria is really not producing anything that would threaten any of the other countries in Africa. I would say actually that South Africa has an edge. If you're looking at the equivalent of Germany in the EU, for Africa, it will be South Africa, in my view. And by the way, Nigeria is already a member of ECOWAS, and that's not creating any issues for anyone within ECOWAS. I think the way Africans should look at this is that this in itself is the right step in the right direction. And then we all need to work together to make sure that it's a win-win situation for all of us. This is not like, a zero-sum game. It's actually saying instead of China importing into Africa, can't Africa produce for itself? And that's what we should be looking at, rather than whether one country will dominate the other. The procedures and the protocols under the treaty itself already take care of those issues. And with the implementation, if everybody does it with sincerity of purpose and in good faith, then it should be okay for all the countries across Africa.
Dianna, it's all good and well when trading blocks like this, something that the continent has really been trying to work towards, as I said, since January 2012 when it was declared by the African Union. But essentially, when you're saying that you're removing barriers to trade, that you are reducing tariffs, that there will be no tariffs actually, you are really hurting the 17% of intra-Africa trade that these governments used to receive from putting barriers on each other's products. So where will the 17% revenue come from, and how long can African countries stomach this lack of revenue considering the growth rates on the continent?
Well, the issue of trade, of a reliance on trade taxes, has been a big sticking point, I think, in getting the political will behind these kind of initiatives, but also to get people to, to stop putting in place non-tariff barriers and other barriers, and to, to find other ways of raising revenue. Because what it's done is trade taxes have made trade a lot less efficient. So it is fair to say that if a lot of these things fall away, the efficiency will improve. But I think the free trade area really is something that business and companies across Africa should leverage. They should leverage the political goodwill while their leaders are still on the global or on the African stage, committing themselves to this, to say, how about making us more competitive by addressing the business environment, by putting in place more reliable power, by reducing unnecessary roadblocks and all sorts of other barriers to business, and to make it cheaper to produce. Because one of the issues is African goods are not that competitive because they are expensive because of the high cost of production in most African countries. So there's a lot of things that need to also accompany this. It's, signing an agreement is the easy part. I really think these leaders must be held properly to account to see what else they can do to make each country more competitive back home, but not in a protectionist way, but in a way that allows people to compete more on a level playing field than many countries are able to do at this stage.
Taiwo, some say that the drawbacks of this particular agreement will be things like an increase in outsourcing of jobs. Essentially, if your services and products are tariff-free, there's no reason why you wouldn't have a call center in somewhere in Central Africa as opposed to having it at probably a higher tax regime in South Africa. Are you worried about the outsourcing of jobs on the continent? What will that mean for the continent?
I'm not worried. I think if you look at it long term, it's in the interest of Africans for us to have those kind of efficiency days. If you have outsourcing of whatever it is to East Africa, some of them will go to South Africa. You find some of them will come to West Africa, North Africa. It would be the reason why you're outsourcing to those regions is because they do it better than the rest of us. And that therefore means that you get better quality and even more affordable in terms of the pricing. So whatever it is that any country would lose in the short term, I think they will benefit far more than that in efficiency gains in the medium to long term. So it's not something that anybody should overly worry about. And bear in mind that also these procedures, including the progressive elimination of tariff, is progressive. And that's why it's called progressive. So it's not going to be overnight that you're going to do your 17% tariff on the protection that you have currently using tariff. And by the way, I think also the biggest gain that we'll have in Africa as a result of this treaty will come from the non-tariff barriers. Just imagine having to travel across Africa with an African passport. So you then have to eliminate all these issues around visas, and sometimes the process for getting those visas in itself are a huge barrier to do business across the continent.
Dianna, Africa is still known for its produce in terms of extractive industries, oil, minerals, metals. Will this agreement help us shift focus, if you will, increase other less extractive industry, or at least the investments in those? And are you worried ultimately that this agreement could just be a platform for who has a bigger DFI and FDI, essentially?
Well, I think the point is the bigger countries seem likely to benefit more, particularly South Africa, that is the biggest exporter of manufactured goods into the rest of Africa. But I think the point is that value addition to our raw materials has been a big issue for many, many years, and not really that much has been done about it. So hopefully this is a platform again for leaders to be pushed a little bit harder to look at more creative ways in association with business, to find ways to see how the growth of manufacturing can take place. I mean, as we've heard, the growth in services is the big growth area in Africa. But we need to make things and sell them. I mean, that is one of the underpinnings of trade. So if we're going to continue with this extractive industries, raw materials exports, without proper policies to change this, then it's not going to be as useful as it should be. And again, this is a platform to push leaders, because they are now the spotlight is on them to let's start thinking about these kind of issues, perhaps in regional collaboration or in some kind of hubs to leverage the thinking that we have on the continent, rather than each country looking at their own backyard and thinking how they can improve just for themselves.
I'd like to thank you both. Thank to both my guests, Taiwo Oyedele, who's a partner and West African leader at PwC Nigeria, and in Johannesburg and Rosebank, Dianna Games, Chief Executive of Africa at Work, and also the Executive Director of SA Nigeria Business Chamber.